Hi, here I am, Dr. Sunil Garg. On behalf of Essentials of Acute Care and Saving Lives, I welcome you all. This is an educational hub for all those who are interested in critical care. Today I am going to discuss evidence-based landmark changes in practice of critical care. Though a whole lot has been changed over the years, we will go through few of them. Intravenous fluids for resuscitation remained the subject matter of debate for a long time. Now the air is pretty much clear and we have moved a step closer to best intravenous fluid. Now we know colloids are no longer recommended for fluid resuscitation in critically ill patients, and in terms of use of crystalloids, now we know balanced crystalloids are preferred over non-balanced crystalloids. It means Ringer's lactate or Hartmann solution is preferred over normal saline. For ages, it was mandatory practice to administer intravenous fluid for the initial resuscitation of trauma patient in hemorrhagic shock. But data does not support this practice. Rather, data supports the minimal use of crystalloids while awaiting blood product. It does not mean that crystalloids should not be used. It simply means that crystalloid use should be minimized. Rather, hemostatic resuscitation with the blood component, which includes packed RBC, plasma, platelet, fibrinogen, and cryoprecipitate, is recommended to avoid or prevent the lethal triad of trauma and subsequent high mortality. Once considered favorite in critical care unit, the use of dopamine has reduced significantly over last decade, and the use of low-dose dopamine for renal protection is no longer recommended. Norepinephrine is preferred as first-line therapy in most of the situations when vasopressor is required, and if inotropic action is required, dobutamine is preferred in place of dopamine. The use of dopamine is restricted to few conditions where patient has relative or absolute bradycardia and at low risk of tachyarrhythmia. High-flow nasal cannula has become one of the main modality of oxygen therapy in critical care unit, and it is preferred over non-invasive ventilation when patient of the hypoxemic respiratory failure is unable to maintain on conventional oxygen therapy. Non-invasive ventilation is preferred over high-flow nasal cannula when patient is in hypercapnic respiratory failure with or without hypoxemia. For sedation purpose, the use of opioid analgesics has increased considerably in critically ill patients. To achieve the adequate sedation or sedation goal, there are two ways to use opioid analgesics. First is analgesia first sedation, where analgesics is used before sedation to reach the sedation goal. And second is analgesia based sedation, where analgesic is used instead of the sedation to reach the sedation goal. There are few exceptions to this condition, which includes patients with the raised intracranial pressure, status epilepticus, alcohol withdrawal, and patients who are receiving the paralytic agents. Regarding controversy over RBC transfusion trigger in critically ill patient, now the dust has settled. The practice of conservative RBC transfusion is safe in critically ill patient, and the hemoglobin concentration of 7 gram percent is appropriate trigger for RBC transfusion, except in patients with those who have acute anemia in combination with the laboratory or clinical evidence of inadequate oxygen delivery, patients with hemodynamic instability due to acute hemorrhage, or patients with evidence of the acute myocardial ischemia. Regarding the use of albumin, its use has been decreased significantly, and the hypoalbuminemia per se is no longer an indication for albumin transfusion in critically ill patients. Albumin is given during large volume paracentesis in cirrhotic patients, during sepsis resuscitation when patient need large volume resuscitation and the initial resuscitation has already been done with the crystalloids, and in patients with the cirrhosis and spontaneous bacterial peritonitis. Regarding the use of antibiotics, antibiotic stewardship is one of the most important component of critical care practice. But when it comes to initial empiric therapy of sepsis and septic shock, this concept of antibiotic stewardship is not applicable. In such situation, patients should be given multi-drug therapy to broaden the microbial coverage. With the growing insight into septic process, its definition has been changed. Now the sepsis is defined as dysregulated host response to infection, and it is manifested by life-threatening organ dysfunction. Sepsis-induced organ dysfunction is defined by an acute change in the total SOFI score of 2 points or greater secondary to the infection, And for the screening purposes, shorter version of the SOPA score, which is known as Q-SOPA, is used. The Q-SOPA is defined by two or more of a total of the following three components. Hypotension is defined as systolic blood pressure less than or equal to 100 mm of mercury. Altered mental status is defined as NEGCS less than 15, and tachypnea is defined as respiratory rate greater than or equal to 22. The conventional teaching taught us that serum sodium should not be corrected by more than 10 to 12 milliequivalent per liter in 24 hours, but this limit has been further reduced. There is lack of evidence that increasing serum sodium levels by more than 6 milliequivalent per liter in 24 hours improves outcome. And for all patients, avoid correcting hyponatremia by more than 8 milliequivalent per liter in 24 hours. Source control means source of infection should be controlled where amenable, and source control is defined as different measures that are used to eliminate the source of an infection, control ongoing contamination, and restore pre-morbid anatomy and function. And it involves a surgical procedure, percutaneous drainage, incision of an abscess, removal of necrotic tissue, or removal of an infected device. In my medical school training, I do remember I used to use mannitol very frequently in patients with the traumatic brain injury, intracerebral bleed, or patients with the rhabdomyolysis. But the use of mannitol in critical care setting has reduced remarkably. Mannitol is most effective as a bridge to definitive treatment for reducing intracranial pressure, like in patient when need to stabilize a patient before removal of an intracranial hematoma. There is no evidence to support a beneficial effect of mannitol beyond the acute phase of traumatic brain injury, and there are no well-designed studies that demonstrate an advantage of mannitol either alone or in combination with the other diuretics over adequate hydration in improving urinary flow and prevention of myoglobin cast after rhabdomyolysis. The utility of hyperventilation has reduced to the same extent as it is for mannitol in neurological patients. The use of hyperventilation should be minimized in patients with the traumatic brain injury and patients with the acute stroke. Hyperventilation is useful only as temporizing measure, while other therapies take its effect in the presence of signs of acutely and severely raised intracranial pressure, which suggest imminent brain herniation. In terms of initiation of enteral nutrition in critically ill patient, bowel sounds is no longer an important criterion to initiate enteral nutrition. The literature supports the concept that bowel sounds and evidence of the bowel function in the form of passing flatus or stool are not required for initiation of enteral nutrition. There is traditional practice of restricting protein intake to renal failure patients, but this concept of protein restriction in renal failure is not applicable for ICU patients. So what are the evidences? ICU patient with the acute renal failure should be placed on standard enteral formulation, and that standard ICU recommendation for protein 1.22 gram per kg, actual body weight and energy 25 to 30 kilocalorie per kg per day should be followed. Protein should not be restricted in ICU patient with renal insufficiency to avoid or delay initiating dialysis therapy. Parenteral nutrition was preferred mode of nutritional delivery in acute pancreatitis in the past, but the utility of parenteral nutrition in early pancreatitis is no longer valid. Enteral nutrition is preferred over parenteral nutrition in patients with the severe acute pancreatitis who require nutrition therapy. And for patients with the severe acute pancreatitis, when enteral nutrition is not feasible, use of the parenteral nutrition should be considered after 1 week from the onset of pancreatitis episode. Regarding use of prophylactic antibiotics in acute pancreatitis, the jury is still out. At this time, the routine use of antibiotic as prophylaxis against infection in severe acute pancreatitis is not recommended. If you have any feedback, suggestion or comments, please write down in the comment section box. Thanks for watching this video.